Hello everyone, and welcome to this first webinar in the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's short series about restoring invaded sites. My name is Claire Ryan, coordinator of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and I will be your moderator for today. Hopefully what you are all seeing on screen is a welcome slide with some brief tips for Adobe Connect audio and other functions. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at this, but I'll run through it very quickly for those who just logged on. The first item is voice over IP audio troubleshooting. You do want the speaker icon that is in the blue control bar at the top to be green, as is pictured. If it isn't green, if it's white, you want to click on it once to enable your speakers, and also you can control your speaker volume through that button as well. If that doesn't work, you can use the audio setup wizard that's accessible through the meeting menu, which is also accessible through that blue bar at the top of your screen. If you are not using voice over IP, you may dial in using the information on the right. We will be handling question and answers for our webinars through the chat box. So if you have a question, I do encourage you to write it in the chat box using as much detail as you want, and we will read those at the end. And then finally, there's a feature in Adobe Connect that allows you to indicate to the speaker if you need them to speak a little louder, a little quieter, to speed up or slow down. I doubt we'll need those today, but just in case, they're there if you would like to use them. And finally, if you're having a lot of difficulty getting your audio to work, you can call a technical support number. It's listed at the bottom of the screen there. You may just want to jot it down just in case. Finally, we will be recording this webinar and posting it online. So if technical difficulties prevent you from fully enjoying it, you will still have a chance to watch it in full. I will email the list of registrants when the recording is available on the web. So I'd like to just give you a little bit of background and an introduction to the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, or MIPN. We're a regional network composed of diverse stakeholders with interest in invasive plants. These stakeholders make up both our membership and our board of directors, and they include researchers and educators, state agencies, representatives of the horticulture, nursery, and landscape industries, and also land managers. Our mission as an organization is to reduce impacts of invasive plants throughout the Midwest. The map on the right shows our primary geographic area of focus. The purple dots you see on the map are the locations of MIPN's current board of directors, and the red star is our headquarters, which is just a little bit west of Chicago. We aim to accomplish our mission by synthesizing and sharing information, and by developing resources and publications. For example, MIPN has developed a database of species-specific control methods, a regional invasive plant list compiled from individual state lists, and resources for gardeners and landscapers. All those and more are available on our website, and we encourage you to check that out. It's www.mipn.org. We're supported by a network of contributing members. I do want to put a little plug in that now is a great time to become a MIPN member. Our 2018 membership drive is going on right now. There are some great benefits of membership, including conference and publication discounts. To learn more about that, please visit www.mipn.org/join. And we do also have a listserv if you're not a member but would just like to kind of keep up with what we're doing and other sundry items of interest in the region. That might be a good choice for you. You can join the listserv by just sending it an email with your basic contact information to the address seen on the screen. It's mipn-subscribe@yahoogroups.com. I want to take just a moment to acknowledge and thank our partners. The U.S. Forest Service Northeastern Region is our primary funding partner for this webinar series, so thank you very much to them. Thank you to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, particularly Dr. Mark Renz's lab in agronomy, for allowing us to use their Adobe Connect services. Finally, I want to acknowledge our partner, the Morton Arboretum, which provides MIPN with its office space and has also given some technical support for my setup here. I mentioned right at the beginning that this is the first webinar in the series, and I wanted to give you an idea of the other topics we'll have coming up. Our next webinar will be on the threshold effects seen in Canada thistle treatment and prairie restorations. I know the date says TBD, but we actually just settled on a date for that. It'll be February 13th, which is also a Tuesday. They're all going to be on Tuesdays, and they will all also be at this time, starting at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. The next after that will be long-term efforts to improve oak regeneration in forest systems, including invasive plant removal. That one will be on February 27th, starting at 11:30. And the last one will be on the MIPN control database, which I mentioned very briefly. It'll be an overview of that database and some recent updates to it as well. And that one will be on March 20th. We will send registration links for these webinars very soon using the same channels that we did for this one. So hopefully you'll see them going around. If you are very focused on Phragmites in your work, I do also want to mention that the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative is also running webinars this winter and spring, including one coming up in a few weeks on restoration techniques. So you may also want to check those out. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Apfelbaum of Applied Ecological Services. Steve is the founder and chairman of AES. The company is a significant presence in the field of site restoration and has worked on over 7,000 projects around the country and some internationally as well. In addition to his technical work, Steve is an accomplished author and public speaker. He's a lecturer in landscape architecture at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and has authored important books in the field, including 2009's Nature's Second Chance and 2010's How-To Guide, Restoring Ecological Health to Your Land, which was co-authored with Dr. Alan Haney. I think we're in for a real treat today, so without further ado, I'm going to back out of these slides and hand things over to Steve. A little programming note, I do want to warn you that Steve's presentation in this recording is going to start rather abruptly and seemingly in progress. We ran into an error with our recording, and the recording picks up with Steve's maybe third or fourth slide, and it does continue through the end of the question and answer session. So I do apologize for that error, but we do have a lot of good content that did make it into the recording, and we did want to share that. So thank you very much.
Salt Lake, Jordan River marshes in Salt Lake City, where it's actually taking over bulrush and cattail growths that have been part of large duck club and other important habitat areas. Gulf coastal areas where you're looking at the intercoastal waterway, the linear feature in the lower left of the image. Anywhere there's dredge spoils or anywhere the salinity gradient of the coastal zone has been modified, Phragmites has moved in. Very complex genetics about Phragmites in the Gulf coastal area that we can talk about if you want. Some of the work that we've been doing is on the Great Lakes, quite a bit of the work, and there's an image in the lower left of Green Bay and the image in the upper left of Green Bay. So Omni-Present and Spreading is the story that we're learning about Phragmites. We're also learning quite a bit about the rate of spread, and the rate of spread is actually increasing. The image, before 1910 and after 1960, and then the graphic you see there on spread with Lake Erie water level changes and water level control changes. Everywhere that it's colonized that we're aware of, it has typically spotted in along usually drainage ways, agricultural ditches, channelized streams, in sediment deposits along coastal zones, and in modified, usually salinity modified zones like in the Great Salt Lake and along highway medians throughout the U.S., and spreading from those locations quickly into adjacent landscapes. We've learned that there's a series of problems with this plant that are serious challenges, some that we're only now beginning to appreciate. You'll see in red the wildfire hazard risk. This is a plant that's producing 30 to 60 tons of dry biomass per acre per year. And I don't know about what you know about wildfire, but what we're seeing occurring in California now has started as ground fires with 10 tons, 8 tons, 5 tons, 3 tons of combustible biomass per acre. Then the fire then ladders up into the tree cover, which is 300 or 400, 500 tons of combustible biomass. But wildfire risk is going to become an increasing threat, especially as Phragmites colonizes nearshore environments and in urban and semi-urban landscapes. But the other risks and other threats, include coastal erosion. This plant produces primarily a laminar rhizome system with anchor rhizomes that are usually small in diameter that may go down several feet. But the laminar rhizome mat that it forms really peels back and is undermined quickly in coastal environments with increasing wave energy, with storm intensification. We're seeing, in general, declining biodiversity below the water, above the water, and on the plant itself. The different rails and different wetland birds that typically use a more diverse emergent wetland in any setting are typically reduced significantly, or can be reduced significantly, down to a few species of birds. These can be important habitats in some urban areas. Yellow-crowned night herons, all sorts of herons and so forth, will nest if there are not other suitable nesting environments. And some of the colonies in the Calumet area, south of southern end of Lake Michigan, are very large, where these Phragmites stands are being used. Property value impacts is something that we hadn't really thought about as ecologists, but if your waterfront on your lake or on your shoreland zoned lakefront or riverfront becomes a 15-foot tall wall of green, and you can no longer see the lake, and you have to cut your way out, cut trails out to the lake to access with a boat or to go fishing, that direct and indirect impact on property value and the use of the land is a real issue. We've also learned that the programs that have been in place to manage the Phragmites have largely been piecemeal control rather than systems approaches. The Phragmites locations were, at least where the large, dense monotypic stands occur, were identified, and then grant funding that wasn't a long-term commitment. Usually it was a one-shot deal. Maybe a 2-year or a 3-year grant was put to work to go out and with an eradication mentality to begin trying to bring some control over that Phragmites. What we're really dealing with is a challenge that is a very large landscape conservation and landscape management issue, where the ecosystems over the large landscape are very, very complex, very dynamic. There's primary and secondary biophysical controls over those landscapes, like water levels in the Great Lakes. There's substrate controls over the way this plant moves. There's a range of complexity that doesn't lend itself to a simple one treatment, one strategy fixes all sort of prescription for managing this plant. What we've been learning is that thinking more in terms of precision conservation, where you actually have to understand the biophysical conditions in the locations where you're contemplating treatment, and then match the treatment strategies with those biophysical conditions and site dynamics, becomes really, really important, especially if you've only got one shot of money to begin the process of restoration. There's an adaptive management process that supports this precision conservation that We can start anywhere in this cycle, but the place we usually start is with detection and mapping to assess the problem. Where is the Phragmites, and then stratify the conditions, the biophysical conditions, substrate types, hydraulics, hydrology, water chemistry, modifications of the hydraulics and the chemistry. Stratify that over the landscape that you're looking at, and begin to identify the different type of conditions, not just the biophysical conditions, because you'll learn quickly here in a minute that many of the control options are not possible because of locations where Phragmites occurs. In urban settings next to petroleum tanks, we want to take all precautions to make sure that we're not creating other problems by trying to focus on managing Phragmites. So what we've typically done is used very high resolution multispectral or multi-temporal imagery from an airplane to detect and map Phragmites, and then complemented that with field measurements, and we'll talk about some of that in a minute here, and use the field measurements to further evaluate and adjust the ideas about management, and certainly adjust the ideas about the risk of managing or not managing in any particular location. And then the design and the implementation of the management typically occurs, and when we have the luxury of time, which we have not had with GLRI funding, we've literally had to jump in, everybody's had to jump into shovel ready, quote unquote, behavior, which isn't the right way to combine science and management and adaptive learning. It really does start best with some design work that is based on actual pre-sampling and testing what's likely to work and what the various options are for more effective treatment strategies. So if you have the luxury of time, typically some sort of replicated, not necessarily controlled testing would be done or can be done to test different methods, test different strategies, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes here. And then once you settle on the strategy or strategies that can be effectively and affordably taken to scale, you implement and immediately link a very, very decisive and discrete monitoring program. So your metrics on measuring the effectiveness of the treatment and the response of the plant community that you hope to replace as Phragmites can be effectively understood, so that any adaptive process, evaluation, adjust, reassess, and reapply can be done very quickly and effectively. The remote sensing that we've used, we actually made the mistake of investing in an airplane and a high value camera, because what we were learning at the time was that there really were very few, when we started doing this work, very few camera technologies that could sit on a small airplane and could fly below the cloud deck or get into a site in an urban setting when we phenologically needed to see the plants. We were having an awfully challenging time hiring, the high altitude planes that fly typically above 14 to 18,000 feet above mean sea level, and getting good cloud-free cover, and even more importantly, getting good, accurate representations of the imagery because of all the atmospheric effects of flying through and photographing through humidity and especially over large water bodies through fog and cloud cover, which changes very rapidly. So we chose a camera that allowed us to get in, fly low and slow, and really get good precision over mapping of Phragmites and some of the other invasive species that we're working with. What I think we've learned with humility is that not all sensors are the same, and not all imagery and not all data that can be generated by different sensors generates comparability. You can see here with high resolution multispectral worldview 2 satellite imagery, pulsar Landsat imagery, a little drone image in the lower left, and then 1 meter NAPE imagery in the left. That all of the imagery produces very different results, even with the best remote sensing classification work. So figuring out what imagery and what sensor provides for the best detection and best mapping, and even more importantly, it's pretty straightforward to map large monotypic populations of Phragmites, but that's the easy part. Isn't what we really need to focus on. It's the hard part where we need to focus on new colonizations, where you might have a scattering of a couple stems of Phragmites per acre, and 3 years later you've got dense populations. 5 years later, even monotypic stands. So picking up those early colonizations with enough resolution and precision is more critical, perhaps, than picking up the large dense populations, if that makes sense to folks. The other thing we've learned is that multi-temporal imagery is really critical. A few weeks difference in timing and the water level on the Great Lakes may go down after early spring highs or a normal cyclical high, and when the high water goes down, that will, at some water level, some hydraulic stage, it'll trigger the rapid growth of Phragmites. So understanding those temporal relationships, which we learned about by using multi-temporal imagery, was really critical to understand the timing for both detection and mapping, and even more importantly, understand the timing for treatment. And even more importantly, understanding the timing for effective monitoring. Nothing worse than thinking you've effectively managed something and then the colony disappears under a high water stage, and you think you've got it, and the next spring it reappears and you think you've got it. It's all brown and doesn't look very happy. And a few weeks later, when the water level goes down, it re-emerges as a vigorous stand. Different types of imagery are also important. Different spectral signatures or wavelengths are important. One of the things we found useful is the human brain isn't programmed to really look vertically from a nadar view over landscapes. You really have to train yourself, and us pilots understand how to do that. But when you're working with aerial photographs, it's a lot easier for the eye to detect discontinuities, to detect changes, to identify targets or search image targets if you have oblique imagery. So a lot of what we've done is low and slow, 500 feet, 1,000 feet above ground level, AGL, where we're taking about a 30 to 45 degree angular shot out the windows of airplanes and running lines to give us these parallel oblique images. That's been very, very important because you can detect the verticality of the plant materials, and you can see texture and shade a lot easier than you can with a nadir image. Not discounting the value of nadir images, especially for doing measurements of the size of the colony or the exact locations of the colony. You can see the infrared ortho photography in the lower left, and the same analysis of that same imagery showing Phragmites in the lower right, and then a natural color image in the upper right. So the timing, multi-temporal, and then the nature of the radiation of the spectral bands that are used becomes critical. And then oblique imagery is really helpful to help the human mind really pick up discontinuities and detect small populations even. Designing the solution for how to restore or how to manage Phragmites is really, it can be pretty overwhelming and complex. So here's the metropolitan area of downtown Green Bay on Lake Michigan, on Green Bay that is, and you could see the live Phragmites stands and the treated Phragmites stands in this particular image. mapping the distribution is the first step, and that begins to help clarify where and what type of strategies might be used to manage Phragmites. It also identifies the stakeholders that you're likely going to be having to interact with in one way or the other. You either a priori work with them and let them know what the risks are associated with treatment and non-treatment, and learn about their fears and concerns they might have. So we've typically, with partners, had public engagement charrettes where the mapping that was done of Phragmites and perhaps other invasive plants of concern is presented to neighbors, neighborhoods, community groups, the city council, the planning commission, or others, and all the regulators that might have some sort of involvement in the process or might own land. Certainly all the landowners where any treatment might be contemplated. You don't treat on private property without the permission of the private landowner, or on public property for that matter, without concurrence with the public landowner. So the public engagement process has been really critical, and that has been useful for not only picking up a little more on the ground intelligence about what's actually out there where we haven't visited, but also engages people that want to know more over time about how they can help. If they, what we're learning is quite a few people are really inspired to make management of invasive species participatory. And any way we can engage and train local stewards, quote unquote, or future stewards, that ultimately will help the cause. The strategies for management become very site specific. You can see in the lower right the Green Bay image, and you can see some of the areas that were defined. A coastal marsh, DOT county right-of-way corridor with Phragmites, large and dense industrial areas, medium density industrial areas for fire risk, right next to oil tank farms, petroleum tank farms is a concern. There's nature centers and isolated areas, that might be important to manage. All the strategies and management considerations that might have been considered during the science mapping and detection process are discussed during the charrette or during the stakeholder process. And then we've learned an awful lot from the people that attended the charrette about what they considered to be fire risk, or what they considered to be, a diminution of property value associated with Phragmites. And all of that kind of plays into the mix to help in developing the prioritization and the strategies for managing Phragmites. What we've learned is that there's a pretty serious overarching dilemma in any project site where Phragmites management is necessary or desirable. There's, the push and pull between, the need to do broad scale treatments where, minimum technical precision might be necessary. And by technical precision, that means using techniques that allow you to just discriminate and treat Phragmites and not other plants, and not overspray or overtreat areas beyond the target. These broad scale treatments might have record keeping and generalized monitoring requirements. And those are contrasted with these, what might be conservation priority areas where, you're really trying to not impact deleteriously native vegetation and remnant or refugia that might be present, or impact native seed bank that might be present. That's the insurance policy for restoration of a site. So almost a surgical precision needs to be associated with the treatments in those areas, and that's typically associated with a requirement for better trained personnel and real precision on the ground, both for the treatment techniques and the monitoring techniques. So how do you reconcile especially when funding requires shovel ready and, almost immediate treatment and has a very short funding window, how do you reconcile, what that would drive you to is the broad scale treatments, get out there and get it done, and reconcile that with the need for this kind of surgical precision where there's high sensitivity areas. That's a dilemma that needs to be worked through on every project, every site, with the stakeholder groups. So the outcomes of a charrette in Green Bay here, for example, is a ranking or a prioritization. In this case, fairly simple. High, medium, and low, based on the risk that Phragmites represented and the landowner or stakeholder interest and participation, and lack of resistance to treatment. In some areas where there was resistance to treatment, stay off my property. Don't go near my property. I don't care, about Phragmites. Just stay off my property. Those sort of properties you see here ranked low typically. This is then used for refining the management program. And that management program, might start with, some of the typical measures of the risk, and in this case, the biological cover of Phragmites as a percent cover, might help refine where you go under that high, medium, and low and begin the work. Do you begin in the area or bimodally go after the area where precision is needed, where you've got genetics that you want to protect and refugia that you want to protect, and then simultaneously go after the larger areas where larger scale treatments can be used and used fairly rapidly. I think what has typically happened in the Great Lakes, to my knowledge, is we've typically moved toward the broader scale, larger scale treatment, in part because of the funding cycle and sunset of the funding. This just gives you some sense of the wildfire risk. I don't know about you guys, but anytime you've got 40 or 50 tons per acre of very highly combustible biomass sitting next to very highly combustible tank farms, oil, petroleum distillate tank farms, this is an equation that is, well, I don't think TSAC knows about this yet, because I don't think they understand Phragmites, but this is a real risk. This is a real threat to large industrial areas and infrastructure in many areas that would be seriously damaged if a fire took off in a location like this. Education and best management practices typically are one way to obviously solve that risk, the fire risk. Here's a fly ash disposal site with Phragmites growing on it, and that right over the hill are the tank farms. Managing that correctly is just critical. I think we've learned that there's management that can be more effective and management that isn't particularly effective, that actually exacerbates the problem. For example, this is looking at sizable landscapes 1 year after a herbicide spraying, where the very precise GPS tracking was used, like precision agricultural equipment tracking of where the spraying occurred. And if you go out on the ground, in the image on the lower left, you can see, even with that precision, for a variety of reasons that we can talk about, 100% effective control of Phragmites doesn't occur typically. The rhizome stolons develop septa that doesn't allow mobilization of the herbicide to occur throughout the entire rhizome system. So there's segmentation within the rhizome mats and the rhizome sections that actually don't get treated and resprout, and you can see the resprouts coming up. Now what's interesting is, from the air, with typical nape and typical remote sensing imagery, you don't even see these small little patches. What you see from the air is an overwhelmingly treated brown-looking landscape, and what has actually happened as a result of this treatment and other very similar treatments is you've actually created growing centers, many growing centers that are typically isolated because of what I mentioned about the rhizome septa. And retreating these areas becomes important and becomes critical for managing these areas. So precision conservation, here's a unit that we have, a marsh master, doing very precise coverage and treatment over Phragmites in the coastal environment of the Great Lakes. You can see the track lines, you can see how they overlap. And even with this precision, there's going to be, the root septa impact on treatment will result in all sorts of little patches that remain that need to be retreated. There's what we've learned is that not all equipment and not all contractors have access to the precision or have chosen to go the precision route. The precision route, this precision ag facsimile, is about the best way we've seen if you're doing wick application or a spray application for ensuring uniformity of coverage. It doesn't guarantee 100% treatment, but it really does provide uniformity. What you can see in this image is that contractors that chose not to use precision equipment and precision techniques simply skipped areas, cow trails between rows. At least that's what the corn farmers here in Wisconsin call when you're planting corn and you don't line your drills up, you leave a little cow trail between the drill tracks. That same sort of patchiness results. And what's interesting about that patchiness is, as opposed to the patchiness created by the septa that don't allow herbicide translocation in the rhizomes, is you're getting plants that are not isolated remaining and colonies that are not isolated remaining with the imprecision that's created by either the contractor or the equipment the contractor is using. Things to watch out for is that imprecision, and sometimes the equipment that we've seen folks using actually mats down the vegetation ahead of the equipment, and the layer of Phragmites on top of the underlying layers actually shields the underlying layers from getting treated by herbicide. So it's not just the equipment and the precision of use of the equipment, it's how the equipment's used in the case of these treatments. To achieve greater effectiveness, you don't want to mat the Phragmites down ahead of your unit, your spray unit, or your mower unit, because you're going to treat less of it with that sort of problem. You can see skips and cow paths in the image on the right and the image in the top. Within a 2-year period, 3-year period, the image in the lower right with skipped cow paths, the colonies recoalesce and quickly regrow, and we oftentimes see that it doesn't look like we've accomplished much. The only thing we've accomplished, if anything at all, is by mowing, which was what was done after the herbicide treatment on these sites. We've eliminated some of the litter that was present, and it allows for more effective follow-up treatment if there is the funding to do the follow-up treatment, because you're not spraying as much of the herbicide on dead standing litter. Mapping becomes just critical. You can see, for example, the oblique photograph here in the lower right. See how useful that is to see the Phragmites. You can see the color of Phragmites. You can see the size compared to the other plant materials, as opposed to just looking at the nadir view in the main image on this photograph. Photographic and on-ground monitoring is just critical to understand how effective the treatment has been. And unfortunately, most of the metrics used to measure effectiveness of treatment have been focused on just measuring or reporting the acres that were treated. It really hasn't focused on understanding what's become of the acres treated. So what we've and others have done on, especially on Great Lakes projects, is looked at birds and vegetation and amphibians and fish, and tried to measure and use the diversity of these other groups, as opposed to just acres treated as a measurement. Creating useful metrics becomes really important. I think the GLRI funding, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding, because it was so focused on action, acres treated was the way to tell senators and representatives and the Congress that we were being effective. We were meeting the terms of the intent, but the actual functional response metrics haven't, in many cases, been remeasured after treatment. We've got baseline treatment of vegetation diversity, richness, cover frequency importance value by species, Phragmites cover versus other non-native versus native species cover frequency importance value, breeding birds and amphibians and fish measurements as part of the baseline, but the follow-up measurement in many locations hasn't been done, and that's oftentimes a more important part of the story, certainly more revealing than just acres treated. One of the important things we've learned about is, especially on large bodies of water like the Great Lakes, is water levels are quite dynamic, and both the treatment strategies, the detection possibilities, and the monitoring requirements really do require that one pay attention to the hydraulics, the water level dynamics, and not just assume that you've effectively treated something because it's gone underwater, or you can't detect it when you go back out there to do your detection. Mapping has been really a critical way to not only monitor the Phragmites treatment benefits and effects, but also to use that to really dive deeper into refining the treatments that might be needed for follow-up. You can see on the left, all the different conditions that were found to be present where Phragmites was previously present and treated. Very, very useful. As a last slide or two, I think what we're learning is that we really need to fill some of the data gaps and go back and pick up some of the metrics that were measured as a part of baseline, but haven't necessarily been measured after treatment. And the initial locations that were treated where we've got good baseline data would really benefit from re-evaluation to refine the post-treatment follow-up strategies. I think we're also learning that to train others around the country and beyond, perhaps the U.S., I'm thinking Canada and beyond, that there's locations, critical priority locations. There's wetlands at risk, shorelines at risk, and watersheds that are at risk of colonization, that it would be great to identify existing demonstration projects that already exist in those areas and use those as training locations where the success of prior treatments and rethinking or thinking future treatments can be learned and taught across the stakeholders that need to be involved. In summary, what we've learned is assessing the problem requires specific technology tools. Designing the solution requires this way to visualize and engage stakeholders and develop programmatic long-term strategies. That implementation of treatments requires precision, doesn't benefit from imprecision and not having the right equipment and the right trained sort of personnel. Monitoring needs to benefit from measurement of more than just acres treated. And we need to really hone in on how to evaluate and adaptively adjust treatments, not just to address the areas that are missed because of the sprayer boom not overlapping an area. But we've also learned that we may be imparting herbicide resistance in some colonies where herbicide concentrations weren't precisely doled out or prescribed, and the plants haven't been treated effectively. Those are the type of areas where we might actually have to completely change the strategy, and the broadcasting herbicide approach might not work in those areas if we've imparted a resistance to those populations. The other thing is restoration takes time, and identifying where success has occurred and how success has been achieved is just critical, and then springboarding off of those areas becomes just critical to achieving these outcomes that we aspire to. I think with that, thank you all, and I think there's time for Q&A.
So the first question that came in was when you were discussing the distribution maps and the map of Green Bay with the priority areas highlighted. And the question was, considering how long it may take to develop and implement a management program, how long do you think that these maps are good for? Or maybe what would your recommendation be for the time period in which these should be redone?
Well, that's a great question. I'll turn to Jason and get his thoughts. My thoughts are, in a highly dynamic hydraulic environment like the Great Lakes that are at a high water level now. 1 year ago, they were not. The areas that can be treated right now are reduced because of the higher water levels. So I think some sort of level of monitoring with regular imagery would be necessary, just so you don't waste your time, and try to go out and treat something that isn't treatable during high water levels. Does it mean that you have to use high resolution imagery every year? Maybe not. Maybe during a low water year or a normal water year, you use high resolution imagery, and then if the water level comes up, maybe you use a satellite imagery that you can overlay as part of a multi-temporal analysis and subtract out those areas that are underwater, and that'll allow you to refine your plans for the areas that are still treatable. And then maybe every year or two or three, or some frequency would be my thought, where you'd come back in with the high resolution imagery.
Yeah, a couple things I would add. One is the prioritization process is based on the parcels, and so that is meant to be a dynamic and interactive type scenario where you can play out different landowner priorities or different ways of prioritizing your landscape. The other piece that's contributing to that priority is kind of science-based distribution associated with Phragmites. And of course, you're going to want to be able to document the existing conditions and then post-treatment. That's we saw that being a critical part of kind of reevaluating or adjusting your treatments and understanding why your treatment may be effective or why not, and what specific next step type treatments need to be needed. So thinking about the events, thinking about the dynamics, if there's a significant temporal change like a major treatment or a major water level change, those things need to be considered when thinking about kind of re-imaging and remapping what you're trying to treat or manage.
On the Great Salt Lake, we were working for the FAA at the airport, looking at the white pelicans that are moving into the Jordan Marsh. And what we learned was during an unusually low water year on the Great Salt Lake, Phragmites expanded rapidly into some areas and completely changed the dynamic relationship with these 14-pound birds that represent a risk to every airplane landing at the Salt Lake City airport. Other considerations. So they're really pretty regular imagery to understand the open water changes and the lure to pelicans because of the dynamic between Phragmites and bulrush and cattail. It may be even more critical than actually using the imagery to understand Phragmites changes from year to year, if that makes sense.
Someone had asked what type of application specifically was used in the photos of treated Phragmites sites. It was right before you were talking about the areas where lack of precision had resulted in the cow trails.
Do you mean the herbicide formulation? Is that what the question is?
I think they're asking more about the equipment, whether it was a tractor, a UTV, or a boom of some sort.
I think, well, we showed an image of a Marshmaster, and on the back of the Marshmaster was a boom sprayer, is my understanding, or on the front of the Marshmaster was a boom sprayer. I think we've seen people try to do this with tractors. I know we did years ago where we had a front end loader, and we had a platform on the front end loader and dualed out the tractor, all four wheels, and people basically stood on the deck on the front end loader and did the spraying off of that with both a boom and with a directional a spray gun that they could use. I think the Marshmaster that you're looking at, that's a Marshmaster that has a boom system. We're actually, well, the boom system is ahead of the unit, so it's spraying out ahead before the tracks mat the material down, if that makes sense.
One other thing I would add is that the GPS, the precision GPS component to this. While we're patriotic through the flag is actually for safety. You can imagine how disorientating it can be when treating these large, dense, tall frag stands. And so utilizing the GPS, making sure, the precision GPS originally designed for agriculture is showing exactly the coverage associated with the boom to minimize any sort of overlap and missed areas specifically. So it's a critical part in sort of treating these very large stands, because as you know, if those spray lines are separated and you don't get the necessary overlap to get good treatment, you've got one of those lines that Steve showed on the map, and ultimately those lines will regenerate large stands very quickly.
The next question is a little bit of a two-part. The first part was whether multiple spraying of herbicides contributes to resistance. So treating the same site multiple times with herbicide. And then the second one is how is desirable vegetation reestablished in the areas of treatment? Whether it's maybe typically it just comes back on its own, or if you tend to take a more active reseeding or replanting approach.
Yeah, the first question, I think it's anecdotal, the herbicide resistance. We know that we're imparting herbicide resistance in a bunch of agricultural weeds in crop fields. You've all heard about Amaranthus palmeri. You've probably heard about even giant ragweed that's now showing aggressive herbicide resistance. This is one of those polyploid, genetically polyploid species that's really good at morphing genetically. And one of those species that colonizes high-risk environment, highly dynamic environment. So this is like one of the perfect species where you would think its whole strategy is to morph genetically. So anecdotally, what we've seen is more challenging treatment in populations and locations that have been treated over the years. But has anybody looked at the genetics, looked at gene shifts? To my knowledge, I'd love to learn about somebody that's done that. I think herbicide resistance is a new experience that we're all having in the ag community over the last couple of years in particular. The second question
is how is the desirable vegetation brought back in areas that have been treated for Phragmites?
Well, I think there's only a couple of examples where Phragmites has been treated and other desirable vegetation has been intentionally regenerated. I know there's a number of national wildlife refuges where the duck production, the waterfowl production areas where Phragmites came in, and they roller chopped and they mowed and they herbicided and they kept the stems and the roots under water completely submerged for 90 days to a growing season, and then they either intentionally they intentionally lowered the water level to expose mud flats, and that stimulated Polygonum Pennsylvania smartweed, and stimulated from the seed bank bulrushes. And I know of a couple of refuges where they seeded in bulrushes and seeded in cattail and a range of other plants. There's a body of literature on what's been done in wildlife refuges, and it's all of that nature generally. In the conservation community, there's a number of projects where we've worked on and others have worked on where Phragmites has been treated and the underlying native vegetation and the underlying seed bank has been stimulated by burning the Phragmites litter after it was killed. And the prescribed burning and the removal of the shade suppressing, litter suppressing seed bank has stimulated the response of vegetation. In several sites, particularly on highly degraded fly ash and coal clinkers, I can't remember what it's called right now, in places like down in Lake Calumet, south of Lake Michigan, where Phragmites has been treated and the seed bank was not present for native vegetation. The seed bank has been seeded in small conservation projects. I think one of the most interesting things that we've seen is where the native vegetation wasn't herbicided as part of a co-treatment or with the Phragmites, where only the Phragmites was treated, the native seed bank and the native vegetation below the Phragmites has responded quite favorably in many locations. And I think the most favorable responses that we've seen have occurred in areas where, really the treatment was focused on the Phragmites and not just general broadcast spraying that might have rained down on everything, even the native plant communities that were below the Phragmites.
We have a somewhat similar question from folks out in the San Francisco Bay Area. They're asking if you think that active restoration and revegetation of native plants, typha and bulrushes, for example, can help prevent Phragmites encroachment if you happen to be kind of on the edge of an invasion edge, as it were.
We've seen fairly intact native plant communities around the San Francisco Bay, coastal zone and brackish zones. Around the Great Lakes, we've seen reasonably intact native plant communities. We've seen the same in the Gulf Coast. It seems like it's a combination of the native plant community and then other biophysical controls that seem to be regulating or disfavoring Phragmites colonization. Sometimes it's seepage of fresh water, where where the native plant community is thriving, and the Phragmites is colonizing areas with brackish water or with urban runoff, if that makes sense. So I think location, location, location. But I don't think we know enough. I don't think we understand well enough, what the possibility is of combating Phragmites colonization with intact native plant communities. I think it's a combination of native plant community and biophysical conditions.
We have a question about drone technology. The question is whether a typical drone, such as a Phantom 3 or 4, would that supply imagery sufficient to complete aerial imagery for Phragmites distribution, or would you need to use a higher-end camera-drone combination?
It's going to depend on the size of your site. Utilizing drone technology gives a very nice image and very nice picture. You're really limited on how large of the area your area is. Are you simply going to use the imagery to interpret, or are you trying to do a kind of spectral-based analytics? What I can say is once you get into a larger area, if you're trying to utilize drones, you're going to start, as you have, it all comes down to dollars and the number of times you have to kind of deploy the drone, trying to piece together images of different timing. So thinking about that size and the narrow window at which you're trying to collect the imagery to have favorable conditions to get your best mapping product, and then so those are things you want to consider.
The other consideration is the reality of these coastal environments where many of the places we've worked with Phragmites occur. These are really high velocity, extreme wind environment settings. Flying the airplane 500 feet above the ground and 500 feet off the coast in 70-knot crosswinds. That's what we've typically experienced. A drone would not do well. It would not be stable enough. It may not even, you may never see it again in some of the extreme winds that you experience, especially in the Great Lakes coastal environments. And choosing, you can't get too choosy. If the sun is out and you've got reasonably clear, safe flying conditions, sometimes you don't get many of those days per month. So, you really do have to choose the most stable platform that provides the most reliable access to imagery that will work.
So we've sort of, in a different presentation, looked at the different imaging types and the benefits and weaknesses and strengths of each of those kind of when you're considering the mapping necessary to inform your treatment. And that pulsar Landsat component really is less costly per square mile, but you're not getting the resolution to be able to do on the site, but you're able to get kind of broad regional prioritization. Worldview is kind of in between where you're getting pretty nice detail on smaller stands, but you're still missing some of the smaller areas that become very critical in terms of if you miss them in a management perspective, they remain as a potential source for infestation. So matching up the right image to your scale, budget, and size of your size of targets that you're trying to map are all considerations in the very beginning of assessing your plan.
I'm going to tie a couple of questions together. We had one about whether there are workable alternatives to herbicide for Phragmites treatment, and someone mentioned the potential of utilizing high water or maybe artificially manipulated or human manipulated water levels as a means to prevent the spread or reduce stands of Phragmites. Comment on that?
Yeah. Most of the effective treatments in national wildlife refuges have used, high water after they've cut and kept the dead and live stems well below the water level of the high water. And keeping the plant submerged for typically 90 days to well over a year, a couple of feet below the water level, without any dead stems or live stems protruding, has been very effective. 95, 98% effectiveness in controlling Phragmites. I mean, that's something you might be able to do in wildlife refuge duck production ponds, but boy, I don't know how you'd contemplate that on the Great Lakes.
And lastly, someone asked if there were specific recommendations for herbicide formulations and rates.
I think we'd have to defer, and unfortunately, the people in applied ecological services that are experts and have done that work aren't here right now with us. They're out doing work.
Yeah.
We could probably, if you want to send that question over, we could probably answer that in writing and give you some sense of what we've been using. I think there's been some experimentation to figure out what works best, but I can't tell you the details.
Yeah, the other piece is one size may not fit all, and so thinking about the hydrology and the other physical components associated with a site and what's the nature and the equipment you're using, and so lots of things to consider, and each one may be a bit different. I can say, a lot of the spraying has been done with the glyphosate and imazapyr and some of those combinations that have been kind of recommended.
And then the treatment method, rather than spraying, wicking, it can be very effective, and that requires different surfactants and different herbicides oftentimes, and multiple directional treatments, and so there's a matrix of strategies and a matrix of formulations and a matrix of equipment and so forth that is considered on every project.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Steve and Jason, for taking a few extra minutes to answer additional questions. I want to thank everyone for their participation today. You can always get in touch with us. My contact information is up on MIPN.org. Steve, I don't know if you want to skip to your last slide again where it had your email address. People hopefully saw it, but just in case, if they want to shoot you a question. And otherwise, I think we're all set. Okay.
Yeah, feel free, anybody, to send a note with questions, and we can certainly try to answer them. And if there's any demonstration project potentials around the country to demonstrate any of this, we'd be delighted and honored to learn about working with other partners on projects. Thank you, guys.